Hello, my name is Michael Lenahan, and today's message is titled, Why the Poetic Books Matter. When we come to the poetic books of the Bible, we are entering a section of Scripture that speaks to less to the events and more to the inner life. These books are not primarily concerned with timelines or history, but the wisdom, reflection, emotion, and formation. They wrestle with the deepest human questions. Why do we suffer? How should we live? How do we raise the next generation? What does it mean to truly fear the Lord? The poetic books teach us that faith is not just something we believe, it is something we live. They shape how we respond to pain, how we make decisions, how we love, and how we walk with God in both ordinary and difficult seasons of life. To learn how to live wisely, we must first address one of the most universal human experiences, suffering. And that brings us to point one. The poetic books teach us how to walk with God in suffering. Let me say that again. The poetic books teach us how to walk with God in suffering. Job confronts the assumption that good behavior always leads to good outcomes. Job is described as a righteous and faithful, yet he experiences profound loss. His family, health, and livelihood. One of the key lessons of Job is that suffering is not always the result of sin. The book dismantles shallow theology that tries to explain pain too quickly. When God finally speaks, he does not explain Job's suffering. Instead, he reveals his power, wisdom, and sovereignty. Job learns that faith is not built on understanding everything, but on trusting God even when answers are absent. Psalms gives voice to what Job feels. The Psalms are filled with praise, but also lament, anger, fear, and confusion. These prayers show us that God welcomes honesty. Lament is not a lack of faith, it is expression of faith. The Psalms teach us that worship includes both joy and sorrow. And so I'd love for you to take away from this point one is suffering does not always disqualify faith. Let me say it again. Suffering does not disqualify faith. It deepens it when we bring honesty before God. While suffering shapes us in painful seasons, most of life is lived in the everyday. Scripture also teaches us how to live wisely in our daily decisions, leadership, and parenting. You see, that brings us to point number two. The poetic books shape wisdom for daily living and formation. Let me say that again. The poetic books shape wisdom for daily living and formation. You see, Proverbs is built on one foundational truth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom in Proverbs is not abstract knowledge. It is skillful, God-honoring living. Proverbs speaks to speech, integrity, work ethic, finances, friendship, and self-control. When it comes to parenting and leadership, Proverbs emphasizes formation over information. Discipline is about direction, shaping character, teaching discernment, and forming hearts that know how to choose what is right. Wisdom is passing down through modeling, consistency, and reverence for God. However, Ecclesiastes reminds us that wisdom is not a formula. Life does not always reward wise choices in predictable ways. The teacher repeatedly declares that life under the sun. I say that again. The teacher repeatedly declares that life under the sun can feel meaningless when God is removed from the center. Ecclesiastes confronts our illusion of control and exposes the emptiness of living for success, pleasure, achievement alone. So together, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes teaches balance. Live wisely, fear God, but hold outcomes loosely. Trust God with what you cannot control. Trust God with what you cannot control. And so what I'd love for you to take away from section 2, point number 2, is wisdom is living faithfully before God, even when life feels uncertain or unfair. Wisdom and faith do not stop with decisions and discipline. They shape how we relate, love, and commit to others. And that brings us to our third and final point. The poetic books teach us how to love well and fear the Lord deeply. Let me say that again. The poetic books teach us how to love well and fear the Lord deeply. Song of Songs celebrates love, desire, intimacy, and commitment as God's good design. It reminds us that the Bible affirms relationships in covenant love. Love is portrayed as mutual, faithful, and joyful, not selfish or exploitive. When we read alongside the other poetic books, Song of Songs shows us that healthy love flows from a healthy fear of the Lord. Reverence for God shapes how we treat others, honor commitments, and pursue purity and faithfulness. This book reminds us that God cares about the whole person spiritually, emotionally, and relationally. And so, what I'd like for you to take away from this section, point number 3, is right love grows out of right worship and reverence for God. Let me say that again. Right love grows out of right worship and reverence for God. And so, as we conclude this message, the poetic books teach us how to live before God in a real world. They show us how to suffer honestly, how to live wisely, how to parent and lead faithfully, and how to love deeply. Most importantly, they remind us that the fear of the Lord is not about fearfulness, but awe-filled devotion that shapes every area of life. When we follow these books to form us, we move from simply knowing Scripture to being shaped by it, learning how to live wisely, humbly, and faithfully before God in every season of life.